My name is Renata Voss and I am 36 years old. For 11 years, I have been the majority shareholder and, until recently, the anonymous silent partner behind Voss Whitfield Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing and logistics conglomerate that my husband, Marcus Voss, has spent the last decade believing he built almost entirely on his own talent and charisma. He did not build it alone. I built it with him, and then, when it became convenient for both our marriage and his ego, I stepped back into the shadows and let him believe the story he preferred to tell about himself. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever sat quietly through a humiliation while already knowing exactly how it was going to end. I want to be honest about that decision from the very beginning of this story, because everything that happened at the company Gala only makes sense once you understand exactly how much of my own success I had spent a decade quietly handing to a man who, in the end, did not think I deserved so much as a seat at his table. I met Marcus when we were both 25, working entry-level jobs at a struggling regional freight company that no longer exists. I was an operations analyst with an MBA I had paid for myself, working nights to cover tuition after my parents, immigrants who ran a small hardware store, made it clear they could not help with anything beyond the first year. Marcus was a sales associate with an easy smile, a talent for charming difficult clients, and absolutely no understanding of the financial mechanics that kept a logistics company solvent. We fell in love the way people do at 25, quickly and without much wisdom, and married 18 months later in a small ceremony neither of our families could afford to make lavish. 3 years into our marriage, the freight company we both worked for collapsed under mismanagement that had nothing to do with either of us, and Marcus, devastated and directionless, spent almost a year drifting between failed ventures, each one collapsing faster than the last because he had the charm to open doors but never the discipline to walk through them properly. I watched my husband's confidence erode a little more with each failure, and somewhere in that difficult year, I made a decision that would define the next decade of my life. I took the small inheritance my grandmother had left me, combined it with savings I had quietly built during my years as an analyst, and structured the initial capital for what would become Voss Whitfield Industries, naming the company after both of us, but structuring the ownership at my insistence, entirely under my name through a private holding trust one controlled. I made Marcus the public face of the company almost immediately, not because he had the skills to run it, but because I understood, even then, something uncomfortable about the world we lived in. A confident, charismatic man walking into a room to negotiate contracts was taken seriously in ways that a quiet, analytical woman with the same qualifications simply was not. Not in that industry. Not in that decade. Not by the kind of clients whose contracts we needed to survive our first difficult years. I built the operational architecture of the company from a small home office while Marcus took client meetings, closed deals, and gradually absorbed the credit for a company that existed entirely because of financial structuring, supply chain relationships, and strategic decisions I made almost every single day for years, quietly, without any public acknowledgement, while Marcus's name appeared on every press release, every industry award, every magazine profile about rising regional business leaders. I want to be clear that I did not resent this arrangement for a long time. I genuinely believed, for the first 6 or 7 years of our marriage, that we were partners in every sense that mattered, that the public credit belonged to whichever of us was better suited to wear it in a given room, and that behind closed doors, Marcus understood and appreciated exactly how much of our success depended on decisions I made far from any spotlight. I told myself that love did not require public credit, that a good marriage meant trusting your partner to know the truth even when the rest of the world did not, and for years, that story held together well enough that I never questioned it too closely. The first crack in that story appeared roughly 4 years ago, when Voss Whitfield Industries secured a manufacturing contract large enough to triple our revenue within 18 months, a deal I had spent nearly a year structuring through relationships I had built quietly with a supplier network most of Marcus's industry contacts did not even know existed. At the celebratory dinner following the contract signing, surrounded by our senior leadership team, Marcus stood to give a toast, and for the first time in our marriage, I listened to my husband describe, in vivid, confident detail, the strategic vision and negotiation skill that had supposedly driven this deal to completion, without a single mention of my name. Without a single acknowledgement that the entire structure of the contract had been built by his wife working 18-hour weeks from A home office while he took credit meetings over expensive lunches he did not always attend on time. I told myself that night that it was simply the pressure of the moment, that Marcus had gotten swept up in his own performance the way he sometimes did, that he would correct the record privately once we were alone. He did not. When I raised it gently later that evening, he laughed it off, told me I was being oversensitive, reminded me that we had always agreed the public narrative belonged to him, and asked, with a note of genuine confusion in his voice, why any of this mattered to me now after so many years of the same arrangement working perfectly well. I want you to understand something about the years that followed that dinner, because it explains everything about what eventually happened at the gala. I did not stop working. I did not stop building. I simply stopped expecting acknowledgement, and in doing so, I think I taught Marcus, slowly and without meaning to, that my invisibility was not a temporary arrangement born of strategic necessity, but a permanent condition he was entitled to, when he no longer needed to feel grateful for or even conscious of. The quieter I became about my own contributions, the more completely Marcus absorbed the story that Voss Whitfield Industries existed because of his singular vision, until eventually, I believe, he genuinely came to believe it himself, the way people who repeat a comfortable lie often eventually forget it was ever a lie at all. 2 years ago, I began noticing the smaller signs that something in our marriage had shifted beyond simple professional imbalance. Marcus started working later, traveling more frequently for what he described as client relationship trips, growing distant and distracted during the rare evenings we spent together at home. I am not a naive woman, and I did not need much time to understand what those changes likely meant, though I spent several months telling myself a more generous story, the same way I had spent years telling myself a generous story about the credit imbalance in our marriage. The confirmation came, eventually, not through some dramatic discovery of texts or hidden calls, but through something far more mundane and far more damning. I handle, personally and quietly, every significant financial account connected to Voss Whitfield Industries, a habit I never abandoned even after the company grew large enough that most executives in my position would have delegated such details entirely to a finance department. 18 months ago, reviewing quarterly expense reports as I did every quarter without exception, I found a pattern of charges routed through Marcus's executive expense account that did not correspond to any client relationship I recognized: recurring hotel charges, jewelry purchases, restaurant bills for 2 at establishments Marcus had never once mentioned to me despite claiming these were business dinners with prospective partners. I hired a private investigator, quietly, through a personal account entirely separate from the company, and within 3 weeks, I had a complete and unambiguous picture. Her name was Delphine Ashworth, 29 years old, a marketing consultant Marcus had hired 18 months earlier for what he described internally as brand strategy work, though the investigator's photographs made it immediately clear that whatever strategy Marcus and Delphine were developing together had very little to do with brand positioning. I did not confront Marcus immediately. I want to explain why, because I think the reasoning matters for understanding everything that came afterward. I had spent a decade building a company through quiet, patient, strategic decisions made without any need for immediate public credit, and I found myself, in the wake of discovering my husband's affair, approaching this crisis exactly the same way I approached every major decision in the company I had built. I did not want a messy, emotional confrontation that Marcus could later reframe as an overreaction, the same way he had reframed my quiet frustration about the credit imbalance years earlier. I wanted clarity, documentation, and a moment where the truth would be undeniable to everyone in the room, not just to me and Marcus in the privacy of our own house, where he had spent a decade successfully managing every uncomfortable conversation to his own advantage. I continued running the company, continued structuring deals, continued attending industry events at Marcus's side, all while quietly gathering the complete picture of an affair that had, I eventually confirmed, been running for nearly 2 years, alongside a growing pattern of financial decisions Marcus had been making without my knowledge, decisions that, once I traced them fully, revealed something even more troubling than infidelity alone. Marcus had begun, roughly a year into the affair, quietly transferring operational authority within Voss Whitfield Industries to a small group of loyal executives he had personally recruited and promoted, executives whose loyalty, I discovered, ran specifically to Marcus rather than to the company or to me. He had structured a series of internal restructuring initiatives that, on paper, appeared to be standard organizational modernization, but which, upon closer forensic review that I conducted quietly over several months using my own private financial team rather than the company's internal auditors, gradually consolidated decision-making authority away from the board structure I had originally designed and toward Marcus's personal control, all while I remained, on paper, the majority shareholder, but increasingly cut out of the operational decisions I had spent a decade personally overseeing. I understood, once I traced the full pattern, exactly what Marcus was building toward. He was not simply having an affair. He was quietly positioning himself to eventually push me out of meaningful control of a company I had built from nothing, using Delphine. I later confirmed through documentation the investigator uncovered, not merely as a romantic partner but as an active co-conspirator. A marketing consultant whose actual expertise turned out to be considerably more focused on corporate governance restructuring than brand strategy, work she had apparently been quietly advising Marcus on for months under the cover of her official consulting contract. I want to go back for a moment to those early years of the marriage, because I think the texture of that time explains why it took me so long to recognize what was actually happening in the more recent years, and why, when I finally did recognize it, I chose the particular patient path I ultimately took rather than confronting Marcus quietly the moment I first suspected something was wrong. In our third year of marriage, when the freight company we both worked for collapsed, I remember sitting across from Marcus at our small kitchen table, watching him stare at a stack of rejection letters from other logistics firms that had no interest in hiring a sales associate whose only reference had just gone bankrupt. He was, in those months, genuinely broken in a way I had never seen before, the easy confidence that had first drawn me to him replaced by a kind of quiet desperation that frightened me more than I ever admitted to him directly. I made the decision to found Voss Whitfield Industries partly out of financial necessity, but partly, I will admit now with the clarity that only comes years later, because I wanted to give my husband something to believe in about himself again, a project large enough and important enough that his confidence could rebuild itself around leading it publicly, even if the actual architecture underneath that public leadership belonged to me. I do not regret that decision, even now, even knowing everything that eventually happened, because I believe, genuinely, that it saved our marriage during a period when it might otherwise have collapsed under the weight of Marcus's shame and directionlessness. What I regret is never once, in the years that followed, sitting down with Marcus and renegotiating the terms of that early arrangement as the company grew, as his confidence rebuilt itself, as the temporary scaffolding I had constructed to help a broken man find his footing again slowly calcified into a permanent structure that neither of us ever seriously questioned. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me was afraid to renegotiate it, afraid that questioning the arrangement would somehow undo the fragile confidence I had helped rebuild in him, afraid, in other words, of exactly the kind of confrontation I eventually could not avoid having anyway years later, in front of 400 strangers rather than privately across our own kitchen table. The company grew steadily through our first 5 years, expanding from a small regional logistics operation into a mid-sized manufacturing and distribution conglomerate with contracts across 3 states. I remember those years, strangely, as some of the happiest of our marriage, not because the credit imbalance did not exist, but because the sheer, exhausting work of building something from nothing left little room for either of us to dwell on questions of recognition. We worked constantly, side by side in every private sense that mattered, even as only one of our names appeared on the public documents, the press releases, the industry award nominations that began arriving as Voss Whitfield's reputation grew. It was around our 7th year of marriage, roughly 4 years before the Gala, that I first noticed Marcus beginning to speak about the company's success in a way that excluded me not just publicly, which I had come to expect and even encourage, but privately, in conversations where no client or industry colleague was present to justify the performance. He began describing, at dinner parties with close friends, at family gatherings, even occasionally in our own quiet moments together, a version of the company's history in which his instincts and vision had driven every major decision, a version that had started, I think, as simple habit. The same performance he gave publicly repeated so many times that it had begun leaking into contexts where the performance was no longer strategically necessary. I raised this pattern gently on several occasions during those years, always privately, always without accusation, simply asking Marcus, in quiet moments, whether he remembered certain decisions the way I remembered them, whether he recalled who had actually structured a particular financing arrangement or negotiated a particular supplier relationship. Each time Marcus would pause, seem genuinely surprised by the question, and then gradually acknowledge, with what appeared to be real if somewhat distracted honesty, that yes, of course, he remembered. Of course he knew the arrangement between us. Of course my contributions mattered as much as his public presentation suggested. I believed him each time because I wanted to believe him, and because the alternative, that my husband had begun genuinely forgetting or minimizing a truth he had once understood clearly, felt too unsettling to sit with for very long. Looking back now, I understand that those private acknowledgments, however sincere they felt in the moment, functioned mostly as a kind of pressure release valve, allowing Marcus to continue the public performance without ever having to seriously reckon with what it might mean that the performance had begun to feel, to him, less like a strategic choice and more like the simple truth of who he was. Each time I raised the pattern and each time he reassured me, the underlying dynamic shifted very slightly further in his favor, until eventually, I believe, somewhere in the 2 or 3 years before I discovered the affair, Marcus stopped experiencing our arrangement as a strategic partnership at all, and began experiencing it instead as simply the natural order of a company that he, in some genuine, deeply held sense, believed he had built. This matters, I think, for understanding why the affair with Delphine Ashworth was not simply a betrayal of our marriage, but an almost inevitable extension of a slower, quieter betrayal that had been unfolding for years already. The gradual erosion of Marcus's understanding that anything about our success depended on me at all. A man who has convinced himself he built something entirely alone does not feel, I imagine, the same obligation to protect or include the person he has quietly erased from that story, even if that person happens to be his own wife. I should tell you, too, about the specific mechanics of how I eventually confirmed the full scope of what Marcus and Delphine had been building together, because the process took considerably longer and required considerably more care than a simple review of expense reports, however damning those initial charges had been. Once I confirmed the affair itself through the private investigator's work, I made a decision that I understand, in retrospect, revealed exactly how deeply the habits of quiet, patient strategic thinking had shaped every part of my life, not simply my professional decisions. I did not confront Marcus. I began instead a parallel and entirely separate investigation into the governance changes he had been quietly implementing, working with an outside forensic accounting firm rather than our own internal finance department, precisely because I suspected, correctly as it turned out, that some of our internal finance staff had already been quietly recruited into Marcus's inner circle of loyal executives. The forensic accounting work took nearly 5 months to complete properly, tracing a complex web of internal memos, board committee assignments, and financing structures that Marcus had built gradually and carefully enough that no single document, viewed in isolation, would have appeared alarming to anyone reviewing it casually. It was only once the full pattern was assembled chronologically, cross-referenced against the timeline of Delphine's consulting contract and the specific advisory sessions documented in her billing records, that the true shape of what Marcus had been building became undeniable. Delphine Ashworth, it turned out, held a background considerably more specialized than the brand strategy credentials listed on her original consulting contract. She had spent 6 years prior to joining Voss Whitfield working for a corporate restructuring firm that specialized in exactly the kind of governance dilution strategies I eventually discovered embedded in the initiatives Marcus had pushed through our internal committees. Her billing records, once my forensic team obtained them through the discovery process our outside counsel initiated, revealed detailed advisory sessions with Marcus covering shareholder dilution mechanics, board committee restructuring, and financing structures specifically designed to require additional capital injections that only certain executives, rather than the majority shareholder, would have the authority to approve under the revised governance structure Marcus had been quietly building. I remember the exact evening, roughly 4 months before the gala, when my forensic accounting lead, a careful, methodical woman named Estelle Ruiz, walked me through the completed timeline in a small conference room we had rented outside our own headquarters specifically to keep the investigation entirely separate from anyone at Voss Whitfield who might be loyal to Marcus. She laid out documents across the table in chronological order, each one representing a small, seemingly innocuous step that, viewed together, formed an unmistakable strategy to gradually dilute my controlling stake and transfer effective operational authority to Marcus and the small circle of executives he had personally recruited and promoted over the preceding 18 months. "I want to be very direct with you, Renata," Estelle said, "because I think you deserve directness rather than diplomatic hedging. This is not an ambiguous pattern that could be explained away as normal corporate restructuring. This is a deliberate, sophisticated strategy, built with professional expertise, designed specifically to remove you from meaningful control of a company you founded and majority own. I have reviewed cases like this before in my previous work, and I want you to understand that if this strategy had been allowed to continue for another 12 to 18 months, you would very likely have found yourself, on paper, still the majority shareholder, but functionally locked out of every meaningful decision affecting the company you built. I sat with that assessment for a long time that evening, alone in my car in the parking garage outside that rented conference room, before I finally drove home. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than the eventual triumphant clarity of the gala itself. I felt, sitting alone in that car, a grief that had very little to do with the affair itself, and everything to do with the realization that the man I had spent 11 years quietly protecting, quietly building alongside, quietly allowing to wear the public credit for both our work, had used that same quiet, patient trust as the exact vulnerability he needed to exploit in order to take the whole thing away from me entirely. It was in the weeks following that conference room meeting with Estelle that I made the deliberate decision about how and when to finally confront everything I had discovered. I considered, seriously, simply presenting the full documentation to the board privately, quietly, resolving the governance crisis through proper internal channels without ever needing a dramatic public moment at all. I want to be honest that part of what ultimately changed my mind was not simply strategic calculation, but something more personal and, I will admit, more emotionally driven than the rest of the story might suggest. I attended, roughly 6 weeks before the gala, a small industry dinner where Marcus, unaware that I had already assembled the complete documentation of his restructuring strategy, delivered a toast very similar to the one he would later give at the gala itself, describing his singular vision and instinct with the same easy, practiced confidence he had used for years, while I sat quietly at his side, smiling the same smile I had worn for over a decade. Something in me, watching that smaller, private rehearsal of the same performance I already knew he intended to repeat at our much larger annual gala, finally settled into absolute clarity. I understood, in that moment, that a quiet, private resolution, however strategically sound, would allow Marcus to simply continue that performance indefinitely in every other room he ever walked into, correcting the governance crisis without ever correcting the deeper, more corrosive lie that had made the governance crisis possible in the first place. I decided that night that the correction needed to happen in exactly the kind of room where the lie had been performed most consistently and most publicly for years, in front of exactly the audience that had spent a decade applauding a story that was never entirely true. It needed to happen at the gala. The annual Voss Whitfield Industries Company Gala had been, for 11 years, the single largest public event on our company calendar, a black tie evening attended by our board, our senior leadership, our largest clients, and increasingly, over the past several years, prominent figures from across the regional business community who had come to view an invitation to the Voss Whitfield Gala as a meaningful marker of industry standing. This year's gala was scheduled for the second Saturday in November, held at the Grand Ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel, and it would, though almost none of the 400 expected guests yet knew it, mark the evening I finally chose to stop being invisible. I spent the 3 weeks leading up to the gala finalizing the documentation my legal and financial teams had been quietly assembling for months, a complete forensic record of Marcus's affair with Delphine Ashworth, the financial irregularities in her consulting contract, and the governance restructuring he had been engineering to consolidate operational control. I also, during those same 3 weeks, made a decision that I understood, even as I made it, would fundamentally change how the next several months of my life would unfold. I decided that the gala itself, the single largest public gathering of everyone who mattered to Voss Whitfield Industries, would be the moment I finally revealed, in full, exactly who had actually been running the company Marcus had spent a decade taking sole credit for. The morning of the gala, I dressed carefully, choosing a deep emerald gown I had purchased months earlier, before I had even confirmed the full extent of Marcus's betrayal, simply because I liked how it made me feel, powerful in a quiet, understated way that did not require anyone's validation to feel true. I arrived at the ballroom early, as I always did, partly out of habit and partly because arriving early gave me time to observe the room settling into place before 400 guests arrived to fill it. I checked the seating arrangement myself, as I did every year, confirming that my assigned seat remained at the head table beside Marcus, exactly where it had sat every year of our marriage. By the time guests began arriving in earnest, the ballroom had transformed into the kind of gleaming, carefully choreographed spectacle that Marcus had always insisted upon. Crystal chandeliers throwing soft gold light across round tables draped in ivory linen, a string quartet playing quietly near the entrance, waiters in black tie circulating with trays of champagne. I greeted board members, senior executives, and longtime clients with the same practiced warmth I had cultivated over a decade of standing beside Marcus at exactly this kind of event, smiling, gracious, entirely unremarkable to anyone who did not already know exactly how much of the company gleaming around them existed because of decisions I had made. I noticed Delphine Ashworth arrive roughly 20 minutes before dinner service began, dressed in a striking crimson gown that stood out sharply against the ivory and gold of the ballroom, moving through the crowd with the particular confidence of a woman who believed, correctly as it turned out, that she had already secured everything she had come for. I watched Marcus greet her near the entrance with a warmth he tried, unsuccessfully, to disguise as professional courtesy, and I felt, watching that brief exchange, not the sharp sting of jealousy I might have expected, but something colder and steadier, the particular calm that comes from already knowing exactly how an evening is going to end before it has properly begun. Dinner service proceeded largely as it always did, though I noticed, with a detachment that surprised even me, Marcus positioning himself throughout the early part of the evening near Delphine's table rather than at my side, engaging in the kind of low, private conversation that any observant guest would have recognized as something beyond ordinary professional courtesy. I said nothing, made no scene, simply continued moving through the room, greeting guests, discussing quarterly projections with two of our largest clients, behaving, in every visible respect, exactly like the composed, gracious co-founder's wife everyone in that ballroom had known for a decade. It was roughly 40 minutes before the evening's formal program was scheduled to begin, the portion of the gala where Marcus traditionally took the stage to deliver the company's annual address to the assembled board, clients, and industry guests, that I returned to the head table to find my assigned seat, the seat that had held my name card at every single Voss Whitfield gala for 11 consecutive years, occupied by Delphine Ashworth. She sat there with the easy, entitled comfort of a woman who had either not noticed the name card she had displaced, or, more likely given what I already knew about her, had noticed it perfectly well and chosen to sit there anyway, a small, deliberate statement of the position she believed she was about to inherit. Marcus sat beside her, his posture stiff and overly casual in the particular way of a man trying very hard to appear as though nothing unusual were happening, while several board members and senior executives at the surrounding tables exchanged the careful, uncomfortable glances of people who had clearly already begun noticing patterns they did not yet feel authorized to comment on. I stood beside the table for a long moment, looking down at my own name card, which someone, presumably Delphine herself, had simply moved to an adjacent seat several places down, as though relocating a minor inconvenience rather than displacing the majority shareholder of the company hosting this entire event. I want to tell you honestly what went through my mind in that moment, because I think it matters for understanding everything that happened afterward. I did not feel the urge to make a scene, to demand my seat back, to engage in the kind of public confrontation that Marcus, I knew, was half expecting and had likely already prepared a calm, reasonable-sounding response to should it occur. I simply smiled, the same practiced, gracious smile I had worn through a decade of standing quietly beside a man taking credit for my work, and I sat down in the seat where my name card had been relocated, several places away from the head of the table, watching Marcus and Delphine settle comfortably into the positions they had clearly already decided belonged to them. I did not move her. I did not say a single word about the seat. I simply waited, calm and unhurried, for the moment I already knew was coming. The moment when Marcus would rise to deliver his annual address, and the microphone at the center of that grand ballroom would, for the first time in 11 years, finally belong to me. The formal program began roughly 20 minutes later, when the ballroom's lights dimmed slightly and a soft spotlight illuminated the small stage at the front of the room. Marcus rose from his seat beside Delphine, straightened his jacket with the practiced confidence of a man who had delivered this same annual address 10 times before, and made his way to the podium to enthusiastic applause from 400 guests who had no idea what the next 20 minutes were about to reveal about the company they had gathered to celebrate. He began his address the way he always did, thanking the board, thanking our senior leadership team, thanking our largest clients by name for their continued partnership, and then, as he had done at that celebratory dinner 4 years earlier, he began describing, in the same vivid, confident, entirely self-focused language, the strategic vision that had supposedly guided Voss Whitfield Industries through another record year of growth. He spoke about his instincts, his negotiation philosophy, his ability to read a room and close a deal that lesser executives would have walked away from, and as he spoke, I watched 400 guests nod along. Watched board members who knew better nonetheless allow the comfortable narrative to wash over them uncorrected, the way rooms full of powerful people often do when correcting a comfortable lie feels more socially costly than simply letting it stand. Roughly 15 minutes into his address, Marcus arrived at what I recognized, from years of watching him deliver the same speech, as his traditional closing sequence, a section where he typically thanked his family for their support, a brief, almost perfunctory acknowledgement that had, over the years, grown shorter and shorter, my name mentioned with decreasing warmth and increasing vagueness each year as the affair with Delphine had deepened. This year, he did not mention me at all. Instead, glancing briefly toward the head table, toward Delphine sitting in the seat that had, until 40 minutes earlier, belonged to me, he said something that made the air in that ballroom shift in a way I do not think anyone but me fully understood in the moment. I also want to acknowledge someone who has become an invaluable part of this company's strategic direction this past year, Marcus said, his eyes finding Delphine's across the room, someone whose insight into brand positioning and organizational structure has helped guide some of the most important decisions we've made recently. Delphine, thank you for everything you've brought to this table. A polite, confused ripple of applause moved through the ballroom. Guests uncertain exactly who this woman was or why she merited such prominent acknowledgement at a company address, though several board members, I noticed, exchanged the same uncomfortable glances I had seen earlier at the head table, glances that told me they understood, at least partially, exactly what kind of acknowledgement Marcus was actually delivering. I rose from my seat at that moment, several places down from the head table where my name card had been relocated, and I walked, calmly and without hurry, toward the small stage at the front of the ballroom. I want to tell you that I felt nervous in that walk, that my heart pounded the way it might in a dramatic film moment, but the truth is simpler and stranger than that. I felt only a profound, settled calm, the particular calm of someone who has spent 11 years quietly building toward exactly this moment without ever fully realizing it, and who now finds herself walking toward it with nothing left to lose and everything, finally, to reclaim. Marcus noticed me approaching the stage before I reached it, and I watched his expression shift from mild confusion to visible alarm, the particular alarm of a man who has spent a decade successfully managing every uncomfortable moment in his marriage and suddenly senses, correctly, that this particular moment may be beyond his management. I reached the small set of stairs leading up to the stage, and one of the event coordinators, unsure how to respond to the majority shareholder of the hosting company simply walking toward the podium mid-address, hesitated only briefly before stepping aside to let me pass. "Marcus," I said, reaching the podium and gently taking the microphone from his hand, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. "Would you mind if I added something to your remarks? I think there are a few details our guests deserve to hear, given how generously you've just acknowledged Delphine's contributions this year." The ballroom fell into the particular electric silence of 400 people, simultaneously realizing they are watching something they were not supposed to see, something raw and unrehearsed breaking through the polished surface of an evening that had, until 60 seconds earlier, proceeded exactly according to the script everyone had expected. Marcus stood frozen beside me, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward the head table where Delphine sat, her earlier confidence visibly draining from her face as she began to understand, several critical seconds too late, exactly what kind of woman she had been sitting across from all evening. "Thank you, Marcus, for that lovely acknowledgement of Delphine's strategic contributions," I began, keeping my voice level, almost gentle, the same tone I had used for 11 years to smooth over difficult client negotiations without ever raising my voice. "I think it's worth being specific about exactly what that strategic direction has involved this past year, since our board and our guests have a right to understand it clearly." I looked out at 400 faces, some confused, some already beginning to lean forward with the particular hunger of people sensing a genuine scandal unfolding in real time, rather than the sanitized version companies usually present at events like this one. 11 years ago, I continued, I founded Voss Whitfield Industries using my grandmother's inheritance and savings I built during years working as an operations analyst. I structured the initial capital, built the supply chain relationships, and designed the financial architecture that allowed this company to survive its first difficult years. I made a decision back then that my husband would be the public face of the company, because I understood, correctly at the time, that a confident man walking into a room would be taken more seriously by certain clients than a quiet woman with the same qualifications. I have remained, for 11 years, the majority shareholder and the primary architect of every major strategic decision this company has made, a fact that has never once appeared in a press release, an industry profile, or, apparently, in Marcus's annual address to this room. The silence in the ballroom had shifted from confused to something heavier, more attentive. The particular silence of a room recalibrating everything it thought it understood about the man who had just spent 15 minutes describing his own singular vision. I want to be clear that I am not raising this tonight simply to correct a decade of uneven credit, I continued. I raised it because it directly connects to something our board and our guests deserve to understand about the strategic direction Marcus just publicly thanked Delphine Ashworth for guiding. 18 months ago, I discovered that Marcus had begun an affair with Ms. Ashworth, hired ostensibly as a marketing consultant. What I discovered alongside that affair, through several months of careful documentation, is that Ms. Ashworth's actual work for this company has focused far more on corporate governance restructuring than brand strategy. Work specifically designed to consolidate operational authority away from the board structure I originally designed and toward Marcus's personal control, executed quietly over the past year while I remained, on paper, the majority shareholder, but increasingly excluded from the operational decisions I have personally overseen for over a decade. Gasps rippled through the ballroom now, board members leaning toward one another in urgent, whispered conversation, several of our largest clients exchanging alarmed glances as they began to understand exactly what kind of governance crisis they had unknowingly been invited to witness. Delphine remained frozen at the head table, her crimson gown suddenly looking less like a confident fashion statement and more like a spotlight she desperately wished she could step out of. I have spent the past several months, I continued, my voice still steady, working with independent legal and financial counsel to document this pattern fully. I want to be transparent with everyone in this room tonight, because I believe the people who have trusted this company with their business, their investments, and their partnership deserve transparency rather than a carefully managed narrative. As of this morning, I have filed formal documentation with our board of directors outlining the governance irregularities in question, and I have initiated divorce proceedings against Marcus, effective immediately. Marcus finally found his voice, stepping toward the microphone with the particular desperate energy of a man watching his carefully constructed reality collapse in real time. Renata, this is not the place. You're right, Marcus, I said, turning to face him directly, still holding the microphone steady enough that every word carried through the ballroom's sound system. This is not the place for a private marital dispute. Which is exactly why I am not discussing our marriage tonight. I am discussing a documented pattern of corporate governance manipulation conducted by a company officer using unauthorized advisory relationships structured to consolidate control away from the majority shareholder without board authorization. That is not a private matter, Marcus. That is precisely the kind of thing our board exists to address, and precisely the kind of thing our clients deserve to know about before deciding whether they wish to continue their business relationship with this company under its current leadership structure. I turned back to the ballroom, to 400 guests now leaning forward in rapt, uncomfortable attention, the string quartet long since fallen silent, waiters frozen mid-service near the kitchen doors, watching the evening's carefully planned program dissolve into something far more consequential than anyone had anticipated. I want to be clear about one more thing, I said, because I think it matters. I am not standing here tonight because I discovered my husband's affair. Marriages end, and people make painful, complicated decisions in their private lives that are not anyone else's business. I am standing here because that affair became inseparable from a deliberate, documented attempt to take control of a company I built, using my own resources, my own strategic decisions, and 11 years of work that has, until tonight, existed almost entirely without public acknowledgement. I built this company. I have always run this company. And as of tonight, I intend to run it publicly, transparently, and without anyone's name but my own attached to the decisions I make. I set the microphone back on its stand, And I want to tell you that the applause that followed did not come immediately. For several long seconds, the ballroom remained in that same electric, uncertain silence, 400 people processing a truth that fundamentally rearranged everything they thought they understood about the company hosting their evening. Then, slowly, from somewhere near the back of the room, a single set of hands began clapping, followed quickly by another, and within moments, the ballroom had erupted into an applause that felt less like polite social convention and more like genuine, startled recognition of something they had just watched happen in real time. I stepped down from the stage and walked, calmly and without hurry, back toward my original seat at the head table, the seat Delphine had occupied less than an hour earlier, and I sat down in it, directly across from where she remained frozen, her earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the particular ashen panic of a woman realizing, several critical minutes too late, exactly how thoroughly the evening had turned against her. Our board chair, a measured, careful man named Harold Bishop, who had served on Boss Whitfield's board since our earliest years, approached the head table within minutes, his expression grave but resolute. "Renata," he said quietly, "I think we need to convene an emergency board session, effective immediately. Given what you've just outlined, I don't believe this can wait until Monday." "I agree," I said. "I've already prepared the full documentation for the board's review. I can walk everyone through it tonight if that's what the board prefers, or first thing tomorrow morning if people would rather process this before diving into specifics." "Tomorrow morning," Harold said. 9 o'clock, the main conference room. "I'll notify the rest of the board tonight." He paused, glancing briefly toward Marcus, who stood several feet away, his posture rigid, his face drained of the confident color it had carried throughout his entire address. "Marcus, I think it would be best if you did not attend that meeting, at least not initially, until the board has had a chance to review the documentation independently." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again, some final calculation completing itself behind his eyes as he understood, I believe for the first time that evening, exactly how completely the ground had shifted beneath him in the span of a single 10-minute speech. The gala continued for another hour after that, though the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Guests clustering into smaller, more urgent conversations, several of our largest clients approaching me directly over the following hour with careful, probing questions about the company's stability and future direction. I answered each question honestly and calmly, explaining that the governance issues I had raised were being handled through proper board channels, that the company's underlying operations remained sound, that the strategic decisions guiding Voss Whitfield Industries had, in fact, been mine for over a decade, and would continue to be mine regardless of whatever personnel changes emerged from the board's review. Delphine Ashworth left the gala within 20 minutes of my speech, slipping out a side entrance without saying goodbye to anyone. Her crimson gown a stark, retreating splash of color against the hotel's marble lobby as she disappeared into a waiting car. I did not see her again after that evening, though I would later learn, through the board's independent investigation, considerably more about the depth of her involvement in Marcus's restructuring efforts than even my own private investigator had initially uncovered. Marcus remained at the gala for the rest of the evening, though he spoke to almost no one, standing at the edge of the ballroom with the particular stunned stillness of a man watching his own carefully constructed identity dissolve in front of everyone whose respect he had spent a decade cultivating. I did not approach him again that night. There was nothing left in that moment that needed to be said between us that had not already been said, clearly and publicly, in front of 400 witnesses. The emergency board meeting the following morning lasted nearly 6 hours, held in the same main conference room where I had spent countless afternoons over the past decade quietly walking Marcus through strategic decisions before he presented them publicly as his own. I arrived at 8:30, 30 minutes before the scheduled start, and found Harold Bishop already seated at the head of the long table, reviewing a printed copy of the documentation I had sent him the previous evening, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, his expression unreadable. "I want you to know something before the rest of the board arrives," he said, looking up as I took a seat beside him. "I've served on this board for 9 years, Renata. I've watched Marcus deliver essentially the same speech at every annual gathering, and I want to be honest with you. There were moments over the years when I suspected the credit imbalance ran deeper than simple public relations strategy. I never said anything, partly because it wasn't clearly my place, and partly, I'll admit, because it was simply easier not to look closely at an arrangement that seemed to be working well enough on the surface. I think a lot of us on this board owe you an apology for exactly that kind of comfortable not looking. I appreciate you saying that, I said, though I'd rather focus this morning on the documentation itself rather than on apologies. There will be time for reflection later. Right now, I think the board needs to understand exactly what was being built and how close it came to succeeding. The rest of the board arrived over the following 20 minutes, 7 directors in total, several of whom I had worked alongside for the entire 11 years of the company's existence, and 2 more recent additions who had joined within the past 3 years, individuals whose loyalty I had begun to suspect based on Estelle's forensic timeline, ran considerably closer to Marcus than to the board's fiduciary obligations to the company as a whole. I began the presentation methodically, the same way I approached every major strategic decision, starting with the earliest documented instance of governance restructuring roughly 18 months prior, walking the board chronologically through each subsequent step, cross-referencing Delphine's billing records against the specific committee reassignments and financing proposals Marcus had introduced during that period. I watched the faces around that table shift over the following hours, confusion giving way to concern giving way to something closer to alarm, as the full scope of the strategy became undeniable even to the 2 directors whose earlier questions had carried a defensive edge clearly intended to protect Marcus. By the time I reached the final section of the documentation, the financing structure that would have required a capital injection specifically timed and structured to dilute my controlling stake below the 50% threshold, the room had fallen into the particular grim silence of people finally understanding exactly how close their own company had come to a hostile internal takeover disguised as routine modernization. "I want to ask a direct question," said one of the 2 more recent board additions, a sharp-eyed woman named Constance O'Hara, who had joined the board 3 years earlier at Marcus's specific recommendation. "Renata, why did you wait until the gala to reveal this? Why not bring this documentation to the board the moment you had it assembled, rather than staging what was, frankly, an extraordinarily public confrontation in front of our largest clients?" It was a fair question, and I had anticipated it. "I considered exactly that approach for several weeks," I said. "I ultimately decided against it for 2 reasons. First, practically, I was concerned that bringing this documentation to the board privately, before the affair and the governance strategy were undeniably connected in the public record, would have allowed Marcus and his allies on this board, and I do believe there are allies on this board, to frame the situation as a private marital dispute rather than a genuine governance crisis, potentially delaying meaningful action long enough for further damage to occur. Second, and I want to be honest about this because I think honesty matters more than a polished answer, I had spent 11 years allowing a public narrative about this company to exist that was fundamentally untrue. I decided that correcting that narrative privately, while allowing the public version to remain unchallenged, would have solved the governance crisis without solving the deeper problem that made the governance crisis possible in the first place, which is a culture, inside and outside this boardroom, that consistently rewarded confident performance over quiet competence. Constance held my gaze for a long moment before nodding slowly. "That's a more thoughtful answer than I expected," she said. "I withdraw the implication in my question. I think, given everything laid out this morning, most of us in this room owe you considerably more scrutiny of our own assumptions than we've offered over the past several years." The board's vote, when it finally came late that afternoon, was unanimous, terminating Marcus's employment for cause, citing unauthorized governance restructuring conducted without proper board authorization, and installing me as Chief Executive Officer effective immediately, a title that formalized, at long last, a role I had functionally held for over a decade without public acknowledgement. The board also voted to launch an independent investigation into Delphine Ashworth's consulting contract, a decision that, over the following months, revealed additional details I had not fully anticipated even after Estelle's thorough forensic work. Delphine, it turned out, had been paid a base consulting fee considerably higher than her official contract disclosed, with the difference routed through a secondary shell arrangement that Marcus had personally authorized without board approval, using company funds to compensate her, in effect, for governance restructuring advice rather than the brand strategy work her official documentation claimed. The independent investigation ultimately concluded that this arrangement constituted a clear breach of fiduciary duty, and the board pursued legal action against both Marcus and Delphine to recover the misappropriated funds, a process that concluded, roughly 10 months after the gala, with a settlement requiring both parties to repay a substantial portion of the funds in question. Had that strategy succeeded, I would have gradually lost majority control of a company I had built entirely from my own resources, watching decision-making authority transfer, piece by piece, to a man who had spent a decade taking public credit for decisions I had made, guided by a consultant whose actual expertise had nothing to do with the brand positioning work her contract claimed to cover. Had that strategy succeeded, I would have gradually lost majority control of a company I had built entirely from my own resources, watching decision-making authority transfer, piece by piece, to a man who had spent a decade taking public credit for decisions I had made, guided by a consultant whose actual expertise had nothing to do with the brand positioning work her contract claimed to cover. The board, once presented with the complete documentation, voted unanimously to terminate Marcus's employment for cause, citing unauthorized governance restructuring conducted without proper board authorization, and to immediately install me as CEO, a position I had, in every practical sense, already held for over a decade without the title or the public recognition that should have accompanied it. The weeks following the gala unfolded with a particular, unhurried clarity that surprised me, given how dramatically everything had changed in the span of a single evening. Marcus and I finalized our divorce with relatively little contention, given how thoroughly the board's investigation had already documented his conduct, though the financial settlement negotiations grew considerably more difficult once Marcus's attorneys understood exactly how much of the marital estate consisted of assets I had personally built and structured over 11 years, largely independent of any joint contribution he could reasonably claim. The divorce attorneys Marcus retained initially attempted an aggressive strategy, arguing that as his wife of 11 years, I owed him a substantial portion of the company's value regardless of the actual origin of its capital, on the theory that marital partnership entitled him to equal division of assets accumulated during the marriage. My own attorneys, working from the meticulous ownership documentation I had maintained since the very beginning, from the original trust structure I had insisted upon when I first founded the company, methodically dismantled that argument over several months of negotiation, demonstrating clearly that the initial capital had come entirely from my own inheritance and savings, that the ownership structure had been deliberately and explicitly separated from the outset, and that Marcus's compensation throughout the marriage, his salary, his bonuses, his considerable personal spending on the very hotel stays and jewelry purchases that had first alerted me to the affair, had already represented his full and complete share of the company's success. Marcus's attorneys eventually settled for a considerably smaller sum than they had initially sought, a fair division of the joint assets we had accumulated personally outside the company structure, our house, our vehicles, our personal savings accounts, but nothing approaching an equal claim to Voss Whitfield Industries itself. I remember the afternoon the settlement was finalized, sitting alone in my attorney's office reviewing the final documents, feeling not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more exhausted, the particular relief of finally closing a chapter that had taken considerably longer to close than the single dramatic evening at the gala might have suggested to anyone watching from the outside. I moved out of the large house we had shared for 8 years within a month, choosing instead a smaller, quieter property closer to the Voss Whitfield headquarters, a decision that felt, at the time, less like a downgrade and more like finally choosing a life shaped entirely around my own preferences rather than the compromises of a decade-long partnership built on an increasingly uneven foundation. I moved out of the large house we had shared for 8 years within a month, choosing instead a smaller, quieter property closer to the Voss Whitfield headquarters, a decision that felt, at the time, less like a downgrade and more like finally choosing a life shaped entirely around my own preferences rather than the compromises of a decade-long partnership built on an increasingly uneven foundation. I discovered in the months that followed a particular kind of freedom in no longer needing to manage the careful, constant work of allowing someone else to take credit for decisions I had made, a freedom I had not fully realized I was missing until it finally arrived. The company itself thrived under the new, transparent leadership structure the board implemented in the wake of the gala. Clients who had initially expressed concern about the sudden leadership transition quickly discovered that the strategic decisions guiding Voss Whitfield Industries had not changed at all, because those decisions had always been mine, and within 6 months, the company posted its strongest quarterly performance in its 11-year history, a fact that several industry publications, for the first time, attributed directly and by name to my leadership, rather than filtering it through Marcus's carefully cultivated public narrative. I want to tell you honestly, though, that the months following the gala were not simply a clean, triumphant transition into well-deserved recognition. There were nights, more than I expected, when I sat alone in my new, quieter house, replaying 11 years of quiet invisibility, wondering how much of that decade I had spent protecting a story that had never actually protected me in return. I grieved, in those months, not simply the end of my marriage, but the end of a particular version of myself. The version who had believed, sincerely and for a very long time, that love did not require public acknowledgement, that a good partner would understand and value the truth even when the rest of the world did not. I had to reckon, slowly and uncomfortably, with the possibility that I had spent a decade mistaking convenient invisibility for genuine partnership, and that the two things, however similar they might feel from the inside, were not actually the same thing at all. I want to describe briefly the last conversation Marcus and I ever had, because I think it closes this part of the story more honestly than skipping past it would. It happened roughly 6 weeks after the gala. In a small, neutral conference room, our respective attorneys had arranged for a final document signing related to the divorce settlement. Marcus looked smaller than I remembered him looking at any point during our marriage, not physically, but in some quieter, more essential way, the particular smallness of a man who has spent a decade standing on a story that finally gave way beneath him in front of everyone whose opinion he had spent that same decade cultivating. "I keep replaying that speech," he said, once the attorneys had stepped out to review a final clause. "Not the one I gave. The one you gave after. I keep trying to figure out when exactly I started believing my own version of it, because I don't think I set out at the beginning to actually steal credit from you. I think I told the story so many times it just became easier to believe than the truth. I believe that," I said, and I meant it, because I do not think Marcus was, at the start, a calculated villain plotting a decade-long theft. I think he was a frightened man who found something to hold on to, and then held on to it so long and so completely that he eventually forgot it had never fully belonged to him. But Marcus, believing your own story doesn't undo what the story cost. It doesn't undo 18 months with Delphine, and it doesn't undo a restructuring strategy built with professional expertise specifically designed to take a company away from the person who built it. Whatever happened in your own head, the actions were still choices, made with intent, over a long period of time. He nodded slowly, not arguing, and we did not speak again after that afternoon beyond the necessary logistics of finalizing our separate lives. I do not know whether Marcus has come, in the years since, to any deeper understanding of what happened between the two of us, or whether he has simply built a new, smaller version of the same comfortable story to carry forward into whatever comes next for him. I have made my peace with not needing to know the answer to that question. I heard, through industry contacts over the following year, that Marcus had attempted to leverage his reputation as the former public face of Voss Whitfield Industries to secure an executive position at a competing logistics firm across the state, presenting himself in interviews with the same confident narrative of singular strategic vision he had cultivated for a decade. That narrative, however, no longer carried the weight it once had, because the board's termination for cause had become a matter of public record once several industry publications, following up on the widely circulated story of what had happened at the gala, requested comment on Marcus's departure. The firm that had initially expressed strong interest in hiring him quietly withdrew its offer once its own due diligence process uncovered the details of the governance investigation, and Marcus spent much of the following year, according to what I gathered secondhand, unable to secure an executive position anywhere near the level of seniority he had grown accustomed to at Voss Whitfield. I did not take particular satisfaction in hearing this, though I will admit I did not lose sleep over it either. I had spent 11 years building something real and watching the public version of Marcus's talent, the version built almost entirely on borrowed credit for decisions I had made, failed to translate into genuine standalone success once that borrowed credit was no longer available to him, felt less like vengeance and more like a simple, inevitable correction of an equation that had never actually balanced in the first place. Delphine Ashworth's professional trajectory suffered even more severely. The independent investigation into her consulting contract, once concluded, resulted in a formal finding of breach of fiduciary duty that several other firms in the region, wary of the reputational risk, cited when declining to renew or extend her existing consulting relationships elsewhere. I heard, through Estelle Ruiz, who maintained professional contacts across the regional corporate governance community, that Delphine eventually relocated to another state entirely, attempting to rebuild her consulting practice somewhere the Voss Whitfield scandal carried less immediate recognition. Roughly 4 months after the gala, I received a call from Priya Delacroix, a young operations manager who had worked at Voss Whitfield Industries for just under 2 years, someone I recognized but had never worked with closely enough to know well. She asked to meet privately, and over coffee near our downtown headquarters, she told me a story that reminded me, uncomfortably, of my own early years in this industry. "I wanted you to know," she said, stirring her coffee with visible nervousness, "that I've been doing most of the strategic work behind our new logistics partnership with the Regional Shipping Consortium, but my director has been presenting it to the board as his own initiative. I didn't know who else to talk to about this, and honestly, after watching what you did at the gala, I thought, if anyone in this company would actually understand what that feels like, it would be you." I sat with that for a long moment, recognizing in her careful, uncertain description exactly the same dynamic I had lived inside for a decade: a talented, hardworking employee quietly building something significant, while a more confident, more visible colleague absorbed the credit almost by default, simply because the world tends to notice loud confidence before it notices quiet competence. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I want you to know that this company is going to operate differently going forward, not just at the top, but throughout every level of leadership. I'll be reviewing the full documentation on that partnership myself, and if what you're describing is accurate, there will be a correction, both in terms of who receives credit and, frankly, in terms of compensation and title." I want to tell you that conversation with Priya mattered to me as much as anything that happened at the gala itself, because it clarified something I had not fully articulated to myself in the immediate aftermath of Marcus's public unraveling. The point was never simply to reclaim my own credit, satisfying as that reclamation ultimately felt. The point was to build something different, a company where quiet competence did not have to disguise itself behind someone else's louder confidence in order to survive, where the person who actually built something received acknowledgement for having built it, regardless of how comfortable or uncomfortable that acknowledgement might feel to the people who had grown accustomed to a more convenient arrangement. Over the following year, I implemented structural changes at Voss Whitfield Industries specifically designed to prevent the kind of invisible imbalance I had lived inside for a decade: transparent project attribution systems, regular independent audits of who actually contributed to major strategic decisions, and a leadership development program specifically designed to help quieter, more analytical employees develop the public-facing skills that the industry too often demanded before it would recognize genuine competence. Priya, within 8 months of our coffee conversation, was promoted to Director of Strategic Partnerships, a title and role that finally matched the work she had already been doing for over a year without acknowledgement. I think about the gala often, the same way I imagine most people think about the single evening that fundamentally reshaped the direction of their life. I do not think about it with anger anymore, though anger was certainly present in the early months afterward, sharp and exhausting in the particular way that righteous anger tends to be. I think about it now with a kind of quiet gratitude, strange as that might sound, gratitude that I finally reached the point where I was willing to stop protecting a comfortable story, simply because unraveling it publicly felt frightening and disruptive. I think, too, about that seat at the head table, the one Delphine occupied so confidently for less than an hour before the entire evening turned against her. I did not move her from that seat, and I have thought carefully in the months since about why that particular choice mattered so much to me in the moment. I think, if I am honest, some part of me understood instinctively that moving her myself, physically reclaiming a chair, would have reduced the entire moment to a petty, personal conflict between two women fighting over a man, exactly the small, forgettable story that a room full of powerful people would have quietly filed away and moved past within the week. Waiting for the microphone instead, letting the truth itself do the work of reclaiming what actually belonged to me, transformed the moment into something the entire room had to reckon with, something that could not be laughed off, quietly managed, or forgotten by Monday morning. If there is a lesson in any of this, and I have thought carefully about what that lesson actually is rather than simply accepting the satisfying cinematic shape of the story itself, it is this: invisibility, even when it is chosen strategically, even when it feels, in the moment, like a reasonable compromise made in service of love or partnership or practical necessity, has a cost that compounds quietly over time, whether or not you notice it accumulating. I spent 11 years believing that the story did not matter, that private truth was enough, that a good partner would understand and value what I had built even without public acknowledgement. I was wrong, not because public credit is inherently more important than private trust, but because the absence of public credit, sustained long enough, eventually convinces even the people who love you that your contribution was never quite real to begin with, and eventually, given enough time and enough comfortable distance from the truth, they will act accordingly. Exactly the way Marcus did. Exactly the way Delphine was prepared to help him do. I built Voss Whitfield Industries once already in complete silence, absorbing a decade of quiet invisibility, while a man who understood almost nothing about the mechanics of the company wore its success like a tailored suit he had never actually paid for. I will not spend the next decade doing the same thing again. Not for a marriage, not for a partnership, not for the comfortable fiction that quiet competence should be satisfied simply with the private knowledge of its own value. The seat at that head table was always mine. It took an affair, a governance conspiracy, and a single unforgettable 10 minutes at a microphone to finally make that fact undeniable to everyone else in the room. But it was true for 11 years before anyone but me ever understood it, and it remains true now, spoken plainly in my own name, for the first time in over a decade. 2 years have passed since that gala, and Voss Whitfield Industries has grown nearly 40% under a leadership structure that no longer requires anyone's invisibility to function smoothly. I remarried, quietly last spring, to a man named Julian Ferris, an architect I met through an industry charity event, someone who has never once needed me to disappear in order to feel comfortable standing beside my success. Julian runs his own small architecture firm, modest and well-regarded within its niche, and I remember, early in our relationship, testing him almost unconsciously, mentioning some significant strategic decision at Voss Whitfield in passing conversation the way I might once have mentioned it to Marcus, half expecting the same distracted, self-focused response I had grown accustomed to over 11 years. Instead, Julian asked 3 careful, genuinely curious follow-up questions, wanting to understand the actual mechanics of what I had decided and why, and I remember sitting across from him at a small restaurant table, feeling something loosen in my chest that I had not realized had been tight for over a decade. We do not attend galas the way Marcus and I once did, with him at the podium and me arranged carefully somewhere just visible enough to seem present without ever threatening to seem essential. When Voss Whitfield hosts its annual gala now, I deliver the company address myself, standing at the same podium where I once took a microphone out of my husband's hand to correct 11 years of comfortable silence, and I make certain, every single year, without exception, to name every employee whose quiet, unglamorous work built whatever success we are gathered to celebrate. Julian attends as my guest, seated exactly where the head table's other spouse would traditionally sit, and I have noticed, watching him over these past 2 galas, that he applauds loudest not during my own remarks, but during the moments when I name a junior operations manager or a quiet logistics coordinator, whose work most of the room would otherwise never think to acknowledge. Priya Delacroix, the young operations manager whose coffee conversation with me 4 months after the gala first crystallized what I wanted this company to become, now sits on our senior leadership team as Director of Strategic Partnerships, and last year, she brought forward 2 additional cases of uncredited work within her own department, situations she noticed precisely because she had learned, working under our new attribution system, to watch for the pattern rather than assume it did not exist. I think about that ripple effect often, the way a single public reckoning at one gala eventually reshaped not just my own leadership, but the instincts of the people working underneath that leadership, training them to notice imbalances they might once have simply absorbed as the ordinary cost of working somewhere ambitious. I have also, in the 2 years since the gala, spoken at several industry conferences about the governance changes we implemented at Voss Whitfield Industries, not as a triumphant victory lap, but as a practical case study for other companies wrestling with similar, quieter versions of the same imbalance. I am always careful in those talks to resist the temptation to frame my own story as simply a satisfying tale of comeuppance, because I think that framing, however emotionally satisfying, misses the more useful and more uncomfortable lesson underneath it. The problem was never simply that Marcus was a bad man, though his choices certainly earned every consequence that eventually followed them. The problem was a system, cultural as much as personal, that made it easy, comfortable, and even rational for a decade to pass without anyone, including me, seriously questioning why the quieter architect of a company's success should remain invisible while the louder, more confident face absorbed all the credit. I think, too, about my own complicity in that system, because I do not want to tell this story in a way that positions me purely as an innocent victim of Marcus's ambition. I chose, repeatedly, across 11 years, to prioritize the comfortable fiction of a partnership over the harder, more disruptive work of insisting on public accuracy at every step along the way. I understand now, with the particular clarity that only comes after living through the consequences, that every year I allowed the story to stand uncorrected made the eventual correction more difficult, more dramatic, and more costly than it would have needed to be had I addressed the imbalance honestly during our 3rd year of marriage, or our 5th, or our 7th. Rather than waiting until the 11th year, and an affair forced my hand entirely. I do not know, honestly, whether I would have found the courage to correct the record without the affair and the governance conspiracy forcing the question so completely. I would like to believe I eventually would have, that some version of me, given enough time, would have insisted on renegotiating the terms of our arrangement as the company grew, the same way I insisted on renegotiating supplier contracts or client relationships whenever circumstances changed enough to warrant it. But I also recognize, with the same honesty I have tried to bring to this entire story, that it is far easier to insist on fairness in a business negotiation with a stranger than in a marriage with someone you love, someone whose comfort and confidence you have spent years quietly protecting, sometimes at your own expense. If there is a lesson in any of this, and I have thought carefully about what that lesson actually is rather than simply accepting the satisfying cinematic shape of the story itself, it is this. Invisibility, even when it is chosen strategically, even when it feels, in the moment, like a reasonable compromise made in service of love or partnership or practical necessity, has a cost that compounds quietly over time, whether or not you notice it accumulating. I spent 11 years believing that the story did not matter, that private truth was enough, that a good partner would understand and value what I had built even without public acknowledgement. I was wrong, not because public credit is inherently more important than private trust, but because the absence of public credit, sustained long enough, eventually convinces even the people who love you that your contribution was never quite real to begin with, and eventually, given enough time and enough comfortable distance from the truth, they will act accordingly. Exactly the way Marcus did. Exactly the way Delphine was prepared to help him do. I built Voss Whitfield Industries once already in complete silence, absorbing a decade of quiet invisibility, while a man who understood almost nothing about the mechanics of the company wore its success like a tailored suit he had never actually paid for. I will not spend the next decade doing the same thing again. Not for a marriage, not for a partnership, not for the comfortable fiction that quiet competence should be satisfied simply with the private knowledge of its own value. The seat at that head table was always mine. It took an affair, a governance conspiracy, and a single unforgettable 10 minutes at a microphone to finally make that fact undeniable to everyone else in the room. But it was true for 11 years before anyone but me ever understood it, and it remains true now, spoken plainly in my own name, for the first time in over a decade. There is one final image from that evening I want to leave you with, because I think it captures something the rest of this story, for all its detail, has not quite managed to express. Late in the night, after the board members had gone, after most of the 400 guests had filtered out into the cold November air toward waiting cars, I stood alone for a few minutes in the emptying ballroom, looking at the head table where the whole evening had turned. The crystal chandeliers still burned bright overhead, catching the last of the champagne glasses left scattered across the ivory linen, and my own name card sat exactly where I had returned it, back at the head of the table, back where it had always belonged before anyone ever thought to move it. I picked it up, that small folded card with my name printed on it in simple black script, and I held it for a moment, thinking about every gala before this one, every event where that same card had sat quietly at the head of a table while a different name carried all the credit for what it represented. I slipped it into my clutch, and I have kept it since, in a drawer in my office at Voss Whitfield headquarters, not as a trophy of vindication, but as a small, plain reminder of exactly how long a truth can sit quietly in its rightful place before anyone finally bothers to notice it was there all along. I did not move Delphine Ashworth out of my seat that night, and I have never once regretted the patience it took to wait instead for the microphone. Some truths do not need to be forced. They simply need a moment large enough, and a silence patient enough, to finally be heard by everyone who spent years choosing, comfortably and conveniently, not to listen.